Alright folks, welcome to the Chapter 4 analysis for Doctor Zhivago. This is Cams Campbell, your host, and this will be going out on YouTube, as an essay on Substack, and as a podcast, and as a printable PDF. So you've got lots of different ways of consuming this. The Substack essay will go out at camscampbellreads.substack.com, and the video will be 1 week ahead. So if you're watching this on YouTube, you're a week behind. If you want to keep up and get them as they're published, you can get them over on Substack. Right, let's take a look at Chapter 4 of Doctor Zhivago. Part 1. We left Lara after she'd fired her gun at Komarovsky and scratched Mr. Kornakov, then collapsed in a faint. It was at the Svientitskys' New Year party to welcome in 1912. Lara's lying, half-conscious, on a bed at the Svientitskys'. Komarovsky is worried that his reputation will be ruined if news of his attempted murder gets out. He still feels incredibly attracted to this wild, desperate girl. Quote, he had always known that she was different from everyone else. There had always been something unique about her. End quote. He feels obliged to help her in some way while staying out of her way. What could his motivation be? Love? Self-preservation? Pasternak does not reveal anything of Komarovsky's background, so we have to take him as we find him, as a despicable man out for himself. He has already spoken to the police to, quote, smooth things over, end quote, and has decided that he will divert justice by claiming that Lara was not in her right mind when she fired the shot. He leaves the flat to visit a friend and rent a room from her for Lara. 2. Komarovsky's friend and now Lara's landlady takes an instant dislike to Lara. She leaves windows open and makes a lot of noise around the flat. Lara recuperates and, as she does, she thinks of her childhood in the Urals and of her arrival in Moscow 7 or 8 years ago. That will make Lara 23 or 24 in this chapter. She remembers Komarovsky's housewarming gift of a large watermelon when she and her mother arrived in Moscow. That would be back when he would stare at Lara until she blushed. Chapter 1 of the novel. Quote, just as she was intimidated by expensive food and by the nightlife of the capital, so she was later intimidated by Komarovsky himself. This was the real explanation of everything. End quote. Komarovsky is now making no demands on Lara, keeping his distance and doing what he can to help her. Lara is, quote, delighted at his visit, end quote. I don't know about you, but it seems to me that Pasternak is painting Komarovsky in rather a positive light in this passage. Is he not the loathsome man that we thought he was? This line seems a little odd. Quote, as with the rest of his family, he had hardly ever exchanged with her more than a word or a glance in passing, end quote. Does he not speak to his family? And who is his family? We haven't learned that. Kologrivov calls on Lara and is shocked at the state of her rooms. He encourages her to get up and find alternative lodgings. He knows that, quote, this Voigt woman is a pretty nasty piece of work, end quote. He suggests that she move into an apartment that belongs to an artist friend of his who's going away for 2 years, and then gives her 10,000 rubles as a bonus for Lipa's graduation. Lara tries unsuccessfully to refuse. She ends up taking the rooms that Kologrivov recommended. Pasha is worried about Lara. He has not been permitted to see her while she's recovering, and he's more than a little curious that the man she'd tried to kill was now looking after her and, more than that, shielding her from the consequences of her actions. When she recovers and calls for Pasha, she tells him that she's a, quote, bad woman, end quote, and that he should try to forget her. Pasha doesn't go along with this and instead attempts to hurry along their marriage. Pasternak makes Pasha seem a little needy and insecure here. The wedding goes ahead on Whit Monday after Lara postponed it more than once. The postponements had allowed them both time to take their exams and graduate. We're not told in which subjects they graduate, but we know they both become teachers in Uryatin before Lara retrains as a nurse. Russian wedding tradition. At their wedding, Hayward Harari write, quote, the guests shouted "It's bitter," and others responded unanimously from the end of the room, "Make it sweet." And the bride and bridegroom grinned shyly and kissed. The Russian would be Gorka. The wedding couple would make it sweet by kissing. I've never seen it at a wedding in real life, but it's portrayed in lots of movies. There's another scene where a woman throws a handful of silver coins at Lara's feet as an omen of prosperity. The same woman also instructs Lara not to make a cross with her bare fingers, but to cover them with her veil or a lace frill while the wedding crown is being held over her head, and to hold her candle higher than her husband's in order to gain authority over the marriage. She tries to sacrifice herself and hold the candle lower, but Pasha lowers his candle further still. On their wedding night, Pasha and Lara talk, and as Pasha learns more of Lara, the more his spirits sink. Quote, "His wounded imagination could not keep up with her revelations." End quote. It changes him so much that he's astonished to wake up the next day and still be Pasha Antipov. You'd think they might have got to know each other before getting married, wouldn't you? I wonder what Pasternak was modelling this on. His own first wedding, perhaps? Soon after their wedding, they head to the Urals, where both Pasha and Lara have been offered jobs. Their friends throw them a farewell party, and Komarovsky attends. He asks for permission to write to them and visit, as he can't bear to be parted, but Lara denies him. The Antipovs catch their train, and they're away. It's now autumn 1916. Yury Zhivago is outside the maternity ward of a Moscow hospital. He's now qualified as a doctor. Tonya, his wife, has just gone into labour. The Moscow hospitals are full following the Battle of Lutsk, and Yury is overworked. The Battle of Lutsk was on 4th of June 1916 and marked the opening of the Brusilov Offensive. This was one of the largest offensives in world history, held from June to September 1916 on the Eastern Front in Galicia, present-day northwestern Ukraine, and was a huge success for the Allies over the Central Powers. At the hospital, there's a scene where the consultant gynaecologist quotes Hamlet. Quote, "Whenever he was asked a question, replied by shrugging his shoulders and rolling up his eyes, as much to say that, whatever the advances of science, there were more things in heaven and earth, Horatio." End quote. Pasternak translated Hamlet in 1939, and it left a big mark on him. 12 versions were found among his papers. It's worth pointing out that the first of Yury's poems at the end of the book is titled Hamlet. Edith W. Close says the following, quote, "As the first poem in the cycle of the Zhivago poems makes evident, Zhivago himself was fully aware of shaping his own fate after that of Hamlet." End quote. So the gynaecologist's quoting Hamlet isn't just a casual literary nod, it's part of a deeper pattern Pasternak is building throughout the novel, where Yury is consciously cast in the Hamlet mould, the intellectual paralysed by circumstance, watching the world collapse around him. Tonya has a troublesome birth, but a nurse tells Yury that the mother and son are both fine. They are out of danger. Yury visits a nearby patient while waiting to be allowed in to see his wife and child. On his return to the hospital, the gynaecologist greets him and denies him entry. He'd been given the wrong information. Tonya's not doing well, and the baby is still being delivered. Yury's allowed to peep through the door. Quote, "To Yury, she seemed like a bark, lying at rest in the middle of a harbour after putting in and being unloaded. A bark which plied an unknown country and the continent of life across the waters of death with a cargo of new immigrant souls. One such soul had just been landed, and the ship now lay at anchor, resting in the lightness of her empty flanks." End quote. In her essay Characterization in Doctor Zhivago, Edith W. Close states that Yury is distant from Tonya and that we, as readers, are kept distant from her. Quote, "She, Tonya, is almost always kept out of sight. Her actions, such as they are, rarely occupy centre stage, and her feelings are generally reported indirectly. Yury always feels spiritually alone and apart from his wife." End quote. Close then goes on to quote the bark scene cited above as evidence. It's certainly not a scene that reminds me of how I felt when our first child was born. Close notes that, quote, Doctor Zhivago is more than a simple love story. In the course of its many romances, fundamental truths about the very nature of love are explored, end quote. So, Pasternak may not be showing Yury as feeling removed from the birth of his child so much as exploring how Yury loves in a more poetic, impersonal way. Lara and Pasha have arrived at Yuryatin in the Urals. We move forward 4 years to 1916, so they had the baby in 1912. They've had a daughter, Katya, who is now 3. Lara is teaching at the girls' high school and feels as happy as a clam to be back in her hometown. Pasha, on the other hand, is miserable. He dislikes this provincial backwater, considering the locals to be ignorant savages. Harsh. He spends his time reading and studying, and he feels stifled. Pasternak says here that Pasha's relations with Lara were good, but he's afraid of upsetting her, and it's clear that they're not being open and honest with each other. Maybe that's all coming from Pasha through a sense of inferiority. Quote, he would not criticise her for fear that she might take some quite innocent word of his for a reproach. A hint, perhaps, that her blood was bluer than his, or that she had once belonged to someone else. End quote. Surely he would have known if she'd had an ex. And bluer blood? She's from a provincial town in the Urals. How can her blood be bluer? They have a dinner party with some teachers from their school, after which Pasha can't sleep. He gets up and goes out into the cold winter's night, a scene which the same character will see again later in the novel. He thinks through his relationship with Lara and comes to the conclusion that it's not working. The relationship is one-sided and he needs to do something. A passing army train helps him to reach his decision. He's going to the front. Lara begs Pasha to stay and can't understand why he's volunteering after he'd made fun of Lara's brother Rodya for doing that very thing. She soon realises why he's made his decision. Pasha misunderstood her attitude to him. He's got her all wrong, showing that, as my wife loves to tell me, communication is key. There are all sorts of in-jokes there that I don't need to go into. God bless her. When Lara realises, she demurs and doesn't try to fix it. Quote, she had had the greatest defeat of her life. Her best and brightest hopes were in ruins. End quote. He goes off to train and ends up at the front, taking part in the Brusilov Offensive. This is an example of how Pasternak allows history to pass by almost unnoticed. The Brusilov Offensive was a huge military victory for Russia, and it gets barely a mention here other than as a reason why Pasha might not have managed to write home. At this time, Lara is helping as an auxiliary nurse at the local hospital. She then studies to qualify as a nurse and, leaving Katya behind with the Kologrevovs in Moscow, gets work on the hospital train that will be going through the village where she last heard from Pasha. Again, with the trains. Misha Gordon has travelled on the Red Cross train to Divisional HQ to visit Yury, who is now working in a field hospital about 50 miles away. Misha travels in a cart, passing by ruined villages and hearing the sounds of artillery fire in the distance, across a war-torn landscape. He reaches the right location the next day and ends up staying for over a week. The Russians have made breakthroughs in the enemy lines, but Pasha has been taken prisoner. His friend Galyulin thought that Pasha had been killed by a shell while attacking enemy positions. Remember Galyulin, the young apprentice at the railway yard whom old Khudaliev was beating? He's now the equivalent of a second lieutenant, podporuchik in Russian, and Pasha is an ensign, or praporshik. Ensign was the first of the junior officer ranks in the Imperial Russian Army, so Galyulin is one rank above Pasha. The Hayward Harari translation has them the wrong way round, with Pasha one rank higher. P and V have them in the correct order, but each one rank higher than they actually were, second lieutenant and lieutenant. Misha Gordon leaves, believing Pasha to have been killed. Galyulin is given Pasha's belongings to return to the family when he can. We learn that Khudaliev had inadvertently had a hand in Galyulin's promotion. Khodaleyev had shown up as a recruit under Galulin's command, whereupon Galulin was hell-bent on revenge for how Khodaleyev had treated him as an apprentice. This was untenable, and so Galulin requested a transfer to the front. He distinguished himself in his first engagement with the enemy and received a promotion. We learn that Galulin had met Lara back in 1905, and of course he knew Pasha from then too. On meeting at the front, Galulin had noticed a big change in Pasha. He was no longer the, quote, shy, mischievous and girlish child, but an arrogant and erudite hypochondriac, end quote. Galulin soon learns that Lara is working as a nurse at the front, but doesn't know where to write to her to inform her of Pasha's death. Yury and Misha are enjoying a meal together in a Galician peasant's cottage. They spend the next few days together discussing the horrors of war. Wounded men are being carted to the hospital, including one with a particularly gruesome wound, which turns out to be fatal. Lara happens to be standing at the entrance as the wounded man dies, as are Yury and Misha. The soldier who died was Private Gimazetdin Galulin. He died while his son, Lieutenant Galulin, was also a witness to his father's death. What a massive coincidence that all these people should be together in one place at such a time as this. Let us ask ourselves, in what way can writing symphonies be construed as a means to the ultimate end of overcoming death articulated by Vedanyapin? One of the salient features of music in general is its ability to deal simultaneously with several melodic lines whose development differs in time. Interrelations between different voices that had started at different points of the composition and progressed with different speed create infinite possibilities for variation, with different melodic lines sometimes diverging far from one another and sometimes merging into one. I find this argument compelling and will no doubt come back to this idea. It goes against what Pasternak claimed he was doing, which was writing an epic. He claimed in a letter in 1952 that, quote, I need to build a house for which all this poorly written verse can be the window frames, end quote. And then I've got a big quote here that shows where I got that from, which is in the back of A Critical Companion. And the quote reads as follows: intentions of writing a novel that would sum up his entire creative career, a novel that would show, quote, all of life, end quote, are repeated throughout Pasternak's correspondence and documented oral conversations from the end of the 1940s and the beginning of the 1950s. One example. On July the 9th, 1952, Pasternak wrote to V.T. Shalamov about his need to make the transition from what he dismissively called, quote, writing verse, end quote, to a new, more significant and, quote, real, end quote, job. Quote, from all these innumerable failures and things said in the wrong words, I must forge ahead and step across to a world that will give me a unifying idea for all these trivial attempts. I need to do something in life. I need to write a story about life that brings out something new about life, a discovery or a conquest. I need to build a house for which all this poorly written verse can be the window frames, end quote. And that's from a letter written in 1952. Yury and Misha witness a Cossacks toying with an old Jew for entertainment, and they put a stop to it. Yury makes his sympathies towards Jews known, but Misha remains silent. Yury tells Misha how he saw the Tsar during his first spring in the army. He'd come to inspect the unit of which he was an honorary colonel. Yury was struck by how weak he'd seemed, how ordinary. He made no great speeches about the people, my people. And now there are journalists writing bogus, quote, linguistic graphomania, or, quote, sketches and scenes, as well as scepticism and misanthropy. It's a fascinating scene that shows Yury as a writer, a poet and an artist. Misha responds by finally commenting on the Jewish question, referring back to the Cossacks toying with the old Jew and to what he and Yury were both taught by Yury's uncle Nikolai. It's an interesting monologue about the kingdom of God and how Misha sees the Gospels. It's perhaps reiterating the notion of Tolstoyism here. In Chapter 1, we learned that Tolstoyism, an anti-state, anti-church, egalitarian social doctrine of the kingdom of God on earth, to be achieved by means of civil disobedience and non-violent resistance. This was in reference to Uncle Nikolai's being described as a Tolstoyan and a revolutionary idealist. So when Misha talks here of the kingdom of God, he's drawing on this tradition, the idea that Christianity is something to be lived rather than institutionalised, a personal code of non-violence. Yury feels this too, which we see when he talks of how he finds it difficult to accept, quote, the ruthless logic of mutual extermination, end quote. It's time for the unit to move on. Pasha's linen hasn't been washed yet. Isn't that always the way? That's how it is in the army. You just get used to a place and then it's time to move on. The Germans break through and the village is now under fire. They have to evacuate. Yury and Misha split up and Yury is blown off his feet by an exploding shell. Yury recovers. It's now the end of February 1917. Yury learns that a new nurse has joined the hospital staff. Any guesses as to who it might be? Yury is reading mail from Tonya when Lara steps into the ward. Galyulin is recovering opposite Yury. Both men recognise Lara, but neither knows that the other knows her. Lara takes Galyulin's pulse, after which he tells her that he knew Pasha and has his belongings for her. She's surprised and asks for confirmation of what she's heard, that Pasha had been killed in action. Galyulin chooses to lie and tells her instead that Pasha was captured. Only we, the readers, know what actually happened. Lara doesn't believe him. Lara then approaches Yury. Remember that he'd seen her but had never spoken to her, so it's not surprising that she doesn't recognise him. He wants to tell her that they've met before, but he can't bring himself to do it. Instead, he rather brusquely tells her that he's a doctor and that he'll look after himself. Lara wonders at his rudeness, thinking of him as, quote, intelligent in the best sense of the word, alive and with an attractive mind, end quote. However, she realises now that Pasha is dead, she has no reason to remain and should instead make plans to return to Moscow, collect Katya and go home to live her life in Yuryatin. She feels that now that the war is lost, nothing is sacred. Quote, everything had changed suddenly, the tone, the moral climate. You didn't know what to think, who to listen to, as if all your life you had been led by the hand like a small child, and suddenly you were on your own. You had to learn to walk by yourself. End quote. Yury learns that Misha Gordon and Nicky Dudarov had published his book without permission. Is this the first time we've learned that Yury has written a book? I think it is. There's an intended connection here between the outbreak of revolution and the outbreak of this young poet's first publication at the same time. Pasternak tells us that Yury's work was, quote, praised and regarded as showing great literary promise, end quote. Carol J. Avens writes, quote, will revolutionary upheaval enrich his art? The connection has more than a single significance. After all, the impact of the 1917 revolutions on Zhivago's life is in large measure the subject of the entire novel, end quote. Lara's annoyed at herself for not having asked Galyulin who he was. She asks him the next day, whereupon he explains that he was at the Tverzins at 38 Brest Street, and Lara's beside herself in surprise. The chapter ends with the outbreak of the revolution. It gets a single sentence and, as with the Brusilov Offensive, passes almost unnoticed. This shows once again the lyric versus epic argument I set out above. In epic novels, War and Peace being perhaps the clearest example, history shapes the characters. In this novel, the characters live their lives almost despite history. Pasha joins the war effort not out of a feeling of patriotism, but because he's misunderstood his relationship with Lara. And Lara, on her part, becomes a nurse as a way of finding her husband. For them, the big moments of history pass like the weather. And that's all I've got for you this week on Chapter 4. There's quite a lot in it, isn't there? And we jumped through quite large chunks of time as well. What do you think about this idea of the lyric versus the epic? When I first came across that in the Critical Companion, I had trouble understanding what it was about. But as I've read more about this idea, I'm really starting to get a handle on what it means. And I have to say that I agree. I think the way that history is just kind of passed over makes it slightly difficult for people who don't have a knowledge of what was going on in the background. So I think that's where projects like this can actually be very helpful. When I first read the novel, I did have a knowledge of the history, but that's through lots and lots of reading and studying, etc. And I understand that probably for a lot of people reading this, especially for the first time, you might not have known what was going on other than the Russian Revolution of 1917, which I think everybody knows about. The October Revolution is the main one. There were two, February and October. So, and yes, of course, there was the 1905 Revolution, which we covered in a previous chapter. So I think knowledge of the background, while not entirely necessary, is very helpful. But if you don't have that knowledge, you can still enjoy a good love story, I think. So, yeah, I'd be curious to hear how you're getting on with it now, after we've got quite far into the novel. Is it what you expected? Have you seen the film and you're finding this to be quite different? I'm the other way around. I haven't seen the film yet. I'm looking forward to watching it. Maybe this weekend? Don't know. We'll see. Anyway, this is Cams saying thank you for your support, and I'll see you for chapter 5 next week. Cheerio!